I'm a word guy. I think words matter and the language that we choose is incredibly important, especially for someone like me who conveys running concepts to many. I mean what I say and I say what I mean. That's because running is a sport of precision. We measure our races down to the 100th of a second. We measure our courses to a very specific protocol, and we rank our athletes. We do everything very precisely, and I think it's just as important to talk about the sport just as precisely as well. You know, when I got my USA Track and Field coaching certification, here we go. One of the big goals, as communicated by the instructors, was to share a common language so that coaches, when they're describing something, are all talking about the same thing, so that we're not confusing ourselves, and more importantly, we're not confusing our athletes. So with that context, that little preamble, let's talk about why the off season is not really a real term, and I think would be better off if we never used it again. Now, there are many reasons why I do not like the term off-season. This is not just because of one or even two reasons. Let's get into all of them. Number one, I ran cross country and track for 8 years at the high school and collegiate level. I had more than 10 coaches during that time period. And you know what? I never even heard the word off-season. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this term doesn't exist, but it is worth noting that more than 10 coaches in 8 years of competitive running experience, I never once heard that term. That to me is a red flag. Reason number two is that the off-season is a term that is not included in the USATF running coaches curriculum. So if you become a USA Track and Field certified coach, you're gonna go through a multi-day course that's gonna teach you all the basics about track and field, road racing, and all the events therein. It goes over biomechanics, training theory. Actually, let's just look in here. Biomechanics, training theory, biomotor training for the speed and power events, physiology, psychology, philosophy, ethics, and risk management, the sprint, hurdle, relay, jumping, throwing, endurance, and race walking events. This thing is comprehensive. Absolutely no mention of the term off-season. However, it does say time spent in non-training status should be minimized. Interesting. The other major reason why I don't like the term off-season is because I don't see it used by any other top coaches. I mean, I had Scott Johnston on the podcast. He wrote this amazing book, Training for the Uphill Athlete. There's no mention of off-season in this book. Steve Magnus's Science of Running. There's just no mention of off-season in here. We also have Pete Fitzinger's Advanced Marathoning. No mention of off-season, although there is a recovery schedule post-marathon that's included, but we'll talk about why that's not actually an off-season. Nevertheless, Pete does not use the term off-season. Daniel's running formula, no mention of the term off-season. And let's also mention this book. This is my favorite training book of all time, Run Faster, from the 5K to the Marathon, How to Be Your Own Best Coach by Brad Hudson. Amazing training book. He actually does mention the off season, but he says it's only a week off and it includes a lot of cross training. He then goes on to say, quote, off-season slackers. He warns you not to be an off-season slacker. So most of the top level coaches out there don't use the term off-season. The governing body of the sport does not use the term off-season, and none of the 11 coaches that I've had or during my entire collegiate and high school cross-country, indoor and outdoor track experience ever heard the term off-season. So my conclusion is that this isn't a real term. It is a colloquialism. It is an informal, casual term used to describe something that occurs after a major race or at the end of a season. But this is where the problem is, because there is no formal definition of what an off-season actually means. And then that means it's now open to interpretation. And when something can mean anything, it doesn't actually mean anything specific. I could not make these videos without your support. So first, let me say thank you. And this video is brought to you by our very own performance training journal. I have always been in love with hard copy training journals for a few really good reasons. Number one, when I was a new runner and I started keeping an actual training journal like this, I learned so much more about the sport and myself just by that practice. It really forces you to reflect on your training, to think more deeply about what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And if you are constantly reflecting on your training, praising yourself for what's going right, planning for the future, and then looking back on what has previously worked for you, you are gonna really know yourself as a runner, and you're gonna start to make wiser decisions about your training. I also created this training journal because I want you to focus on the training metrics that actually matter. The training metrics that help you improve, get better, and progress with your running. We don't have to focus on everything. We just need to focus on what matters. I also took a lot of inspiration from professional runners that I've talked to on the Strength Running podcast. They're adamant by completing a training journal and reflecting on what works for you and actually giving yourself some praise within your journal. You're essentially completing a gratitude journal. You are building up your confidence in your own abilities over time. And when you look back on that journal before a big goal race, you are going to be reading in your own words why you're capable, why you can do this. And I can think of nothing more confidence building than an act like that. So I hope you check out the new performance training journal. It is now available on Amazon. It debuted as the #4 new release in the running category, and I could not be more proud of it. So thank you again for subscribing to the Strength Running YouTube channel, and I hope you enjoy the performance training journal. Now, a lot of what we're talking about is actually just semantics. It's just using different words to describe something that, no matter what word we're using, is still kind of the same thing. I think instead of off-season, we should instead call this preseason. I just had a wonderful conversation with Matt Meyer. He's a 2:34 marathoner, running coach, and strength coach based in Boulder, Colorado, for the Strength Running podcast. That episode is going to be released this Thursday. So if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, subscribe today so that you don't miss this amazing episode that goes into extraordinarily depth on the off-season, base training, preseason, and really what we're trying to accomplish during this very specific formal phase of training. And there are 3 major goals during a preseason. A lot of runners might know this as an off-season. Preseason helps us define this phase of training more specifically so that we can get more out of it. Your preseason should include, number 1, general preparation for the specific training that you are going to do in the future. Now, your general prep might be running more miles. It might be getting fast. It might be getting really strong. All of that is great general prep. The problem with an off season is that it gives you permission to just take time off, not do anything with any sort of strategy, and really not progress. If we're not doing that, I would argue we're not training, and runners should almost always be training. So our preseason is going to include general prep for more race-specific training that's to come at some point in the future. Now, the second thing we must do in preseason is address our weaknesses. Now, we can have a lot of different weaknesses as runners, and a few of the major ones are, number 1, we are injury prone. Let's use the preseason time to become as injury resilient as possible. Number 2, we could be weak. We could not really be doing any strength training, and that is certainly negatively impacting our training. So we could spend a lot of time getting stronger in the preseason, which is going to have a lot of wonderful benefits when we actually start doing those specific workouts that come later. You might also have an aerobic limitation. I know for me personally, this was one of my problems in college. Because I was injury prone, I couldn't run a lot, so I had to work on both my injury resilience and my aerobic development or my endurance. That's what I did in summer preseason before the fall cross-country season. You may also be someone who maybe has a speed deficiency. Maybe you're someone who's great at the marathon, but man, you struggle when you get to the 5K. let's work on our speed. Let's do some heavy weightlifting. Let's make sure we're doing our strides or hill sprints or hill strides. Let's introduce what Jack Daniels might call R or repetition workouts. These are wonderful things to include during preseason because they're going to help you work on your speed, which you can translate into a faster finish time later on with those more race-specific workouts. And then finally, progression. Even your preseason needs to include progression. And that just means your training is evolving. It is cumulative, it builds on itself, and it should be growing over time. You should be doing new things. You should be doing more of some things, like running higher mileage. So if your preseason doesn't have any progression, I would then argue you're not actually training. And that's the problem with off-season. When you're in an off-season, you kind of think that you're off from training. And so there's very little progression. I think this is a mistake. I think it's holding a lot of runners back. Matt and I talk a lot about the effects of detraining and how if you take an 8 to 10 week off season where your mileage is reduced by 50%, about that, you are going to experience tremendous detraining and you're going to spend more time getting yourself out of that hole of reduced fitness on the other end of your off season. So even though I have used the term off season in the past, I'm going to stop using it in the future. I'm going to try really hard because it's a vague term. It doesn't mean anything formal or specific. And so it's open to wild interpretation. And a lot of that interpretation is not in the best interests of your long-term development as a runner. Now, if you want help planning your season, I think something that's gonna be super helpful is our season planner worksheet. You can get it at the link under this video or at strengthrunning.com/season-planner. And you're gonna learn what distance tune-up races to choose based on your goal race. We're also gonna talk about when to schedule those tune-up races, the length of your training cycle and why you can have a training cycle that's either too short or too long, and major mistakes to avoid. Get it now, and I hope you can design the best season yet so you can run your fastest times possible.